and they're all firing like crazy. And all of a sudden, this shape comes zipping up across my front, and I just snapshot. I mean, it wasn't an aim shot, it was just reaction, pure reaction. And I shot this guy right off the back of the head. Pure snapshot. No consciousness whatsoever. It just happened, pure reaction. And I can remember to this day looking at that body totally dispassionately.
Welcome to Combat Story. I'm Ryan Fugit, and I served war zone tours as an Army attack helicopter pilot and CIA officer over a 15-year career. I'm fascinated by the experiences of the elite in combat. On this show, I interview some of the best to understand what combat felt like on their front lines. This is Combat Story. Today we have a special combat story that takes us from commanding in bloody fighting in Vietnam to some of the seminal moments in our military's special operations history, all courtesy of retired Colonel Keith Nightingale. Keith served 2 tours in Vietnam, one as an advisor to the Vietnamese, where he learned jungle warfare from one of the most interesting and lethal characters in country, followed by taking command of an infantry company in the 101st that had just been wiped out, literally hours earlier. Keith was a founding member of the 1st Ranger Battalion when it was created by Gen Creighton Abrams in 1974, later commanding both that battalion and the Ranger Brigade. He then gives us a fly-on-the-wall perspective of the Desert One catastrophe and the subsequent creation and birth of what we know today as JSOC, to include why we have DIA, 160th, Delta, and more. We touch on Keith's time as the DoD lead, tracking down none other than the drug kingpin Pablo Escobar. Keith has gone on to write 3 books: Just Another Day in Vietnam, Phoenix Rising, From the Ashes of Desert One to the Rebirth of U.S. Special Operations, and A Soldier Looks Back, Memories and Reflections of a Combat Veteran, From Normandy to Afghanistan. This was a memorable combat story that gives us a look inside some of the most significant moments that created the modern U.S. military we all know and love today. And I hope you enjoy this as much as I did. Keith, thank you for taking the time to share your story with us today.
Hey, my pleasure to be here. Hopefully I won't bore you all to death.
No, I'm sure you won't. And actually, my first question is somewhat related to the variety that we're about to get to with your career. And I think with most folks, I can understand that they were in the Army and what they did. My question to you to start off is, when people ask you what you did in the Army, what do you tell them?
Well, man, I served for 29 years, fun in the sun and income too, all the way from the Dominican Republic to, Desert Storm and everything, all the stops in between. Very interesting, very diverse, nothing I planned for in any way. It just all kind of happened. I'm a big believer that life is luck and timing, and sometimes you get good stuff that happens, sometimes bad stuff. So I've had, over the course of that period, probably a fair degree of both.
What is when you say luck and timing, what was the luck and or timing that kind of gave you the idea to go into the military to begin with?
Well, that wasn't a luck or timing thing. That was sort of preordained. I come from virtually every male in my family since the Pilgrims landed served in the military, none of them professionally. I am the first officer in the family that actually served as a career. All the others went in as required, the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Civil War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, and then me, Vietnam. So that was preordained. I knew I was going into the Army from a very young age. I went to ROTC and when I was in college, was commissioned, because at that time I wasn't sure whether I wanted to make the Army a career. I wanted to have an option there. My parents wanted me to go to law school. After my first tour in Vietnam, my grandmother hammered me pretty hard to go to law school. And I finally said, no, I kind of like what I'm doing. So I stuck it out. So in that sense, there was no luck and timing in regard to the Army. It was just, this is what you're doing and move on.
So if they weren't kind of, as you described, the professional military until your time, What was it about service that made them kind of push you towards it, or the fact that you just grew up knowing that that was the expectation?
Well, I think it was just the expectation. My great uncle, my grandfather died in 1921, before my father really was cognitive of his presence. And he was an ambulance. He and my grandmother were in Paris during World War One.
Wow.
He was an ambulance driver for at Verdun for the French army, and she was a nurse at a French hospital. Her brother, my great uncle, was a doctor with the 1st Infantry Division, won the only Distinguished Service Cross of a doctor in World War One. And very nice man. I knew him quite well. You would never think that he's the sort of guy that would be awarded a DSC, but nonetheless, I read his citation and he definitely earned it as a doctor.
Was that kind of battlefield medical?
He was in the 3rd wave at Soissons at during the initial American push. And he spoke fluent German because he had done his medical residency in Dresden. And he got up to the German bunkers and he cratered an aid station with one of them. And there was a fierce German counterattack. And he pulled out his .45 and began in the trench to scream at them in German, giving them orders that they were going to the wrong direction, impersonating a German officer. And they shifted off. And then they continued to have a battle. He led the infantry around the position, had a compound fracture in his right arm, his surgical arm, and then finally was evacuated. And Pershing awarded him a Distinguished Service Cross for his efforts. My dad was an advisor with the Chinese in World War II in the Han Hills with Stilwell, and then later went to Korea with the 2nd Infantry Division. So it was part of my culture, if you would. Yeah. I never materially thought, well, I'm not going to go in the Army. It was always sort of preordained in the back of there. It was baked into my DNA.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you mentioned you do ROTC, and I know you've got, and correct me if I'm wrong, you end up doing 2 tours in Vietnam. How long do you have by the time you're commissioned until you're in your first tour to Nam?
I was commissioned, ironically enough, on the 6th of June, 1965.
Wow.
I went to meet, I had a wife and a small child and a parakeet. The parakeet and I went to Fort Benning to infantry officer basic school and airborne school. My wife followed later on in the summer after I graduated from the basic course and airborne. And then the 3 of us, my wife, the parakeet, my baby, and I all went to Fort Bragg, where we joined B Company 2505 82nd Airborne. And then, of course, very soon thereafter, this is like 1965, early spring 66, I get orders to go to Vietnam as an advisor. Prior to that, when I was in the 82nd, they got me an officer position to go to Ranger School. So I spent January, February, March of 66 in Ranger School, Winter Ranger.
A fun time to be there, right?
Fun time to be there. Then I went back to the division and was sent to language school in April of 1960. Excuse me, I'm a year behind here. Old guy, Alzheimer's. In the early spring of 67, I got the orders to Ranger School, and then in the spring I got the orders to MACV. So I was a year off here. And then we went to Monterey, which was great. You know, this was 6 weeks of immersion in Vietnamese, but you had Monterey, Big Sur, West Coast, because that's where I came from, so we could visit our family and all that. And then I shipped out, arriving in Saigon to be an advisor in, this would have been May of 1967.
Can I ask you this, Keith? When you say MACV, is that like as we all associate with kind of SOG?
No, you have MAC SOG, and then you have MAC V. MAC V Vietnam were the advisors, and it was Westmoreland's headquarters. It was the overarching headquarters. Because I was assigned to, well, a little history here. I landed on the tarmac assigned to the Airborne Brigade. They met me, the Airborne Brigade guys, and took me through the processing. And then they said, hey, bag out overnight here. We'll get you tomorrow. We'll just send you to a unit, blah, blah, blah. So I wake up the following morning and I call the office, the MACV office, and said, hey, I'm ready to go. What's happening? He said, well, you had a change of assignment. You're now going to the Rangers. I said, huh? You're going to the Rangers? Yeah, they just had an organization wiped out and need some advisors, so you're going. So I got shifted over to the 52nd Ranger Battalion in Swan Lock, which was one of the greatest things that ever happened to me. You talk about luck and time.
Yeah, why is that? Why?
Well, first of all, it was an unusually competent unit. You know, the Vietnamese are always accused of being sloppy, no good, you know, whatever. This unit wasn't. The elite units, the Airborne, the Rangers, and the Marines were really good people. And I learned that in a very quick hurry. The battalion commander he was one of the Catholics that had evacuated from North Vietnam in 1954 with the demarcation. He went to the Dalat Military Academy. He fought originally with the French Airborne, and then when they left, he joined the Vietnamese Army, where he became both famous and infamous. He was super rigid and straight. He had no corruption about him. He did not want to play politics. He just wanted to fight and kill communists. And that's what he did. As a result, he was kind of a clouded character in the minds of his Vietnamese superiors. The battalion, going back a little bit, tell you about the guy's background. Earlier on, I think it was 1966, Dong Xuai Special Forces Camp was getting overrun. Robert Q. Williams and all. Well, the Rangers were had been tasked to save the unit. And the battalion commander was drunk. And so Hep ended up as the Captain XO, being the battalion commander. And he immediately got into a fight with both the Vietnamese and the Americans because he wanted to land his helicopters directly on the objective rather than like 2 miles away to an allegedly safe LZ and then march up. He said, recipe for disaster. They're going to ambush us if we do that. Well, he refused to take the battalion unless they landed on the objective. So the Americans said, hey, okay, if you're crazy enough to do that, we'll take you. The Vietnamese guy said, hey, it's your responsibility. We had nothing to do with it. And they backed off. Well, he landed directly on Dong Xuai, rescued Robert Q. Williams. And in the debrief of prisoners, he found out exactly that he was correct. They had a major ambush organized en route. They got a presidential unit citation for this. And he was reluctantly promoted to be a battalion commander. I say reluctantly because I saw later on how some of the seniors dealt with him. And, you know, they wanted nothing to do with the guy because he was so completely straight. The bottom line is probably my best professional education was with him.
Wow.
Everything I learned about how to fight bad guys, I learned from him. And he really took the time to teach me. Said, okay, this is where we're going. This is what's going to happen. Bang, 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 boom. Hey, this is what they're doing. This is what I'm going to do. And this is how they're going to react. Bang, 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 boom. Okay, now this is what's happening. And this is what I'm going to do. This is what's going to happen. I mean, incredible lessons learned in the height of Tet with all this stuff going on all over the place. You know, we're losing people like flies. He's taking the time very calmly to explain to me what's going on, what he wants me to do, and how we ought to handle it together. And it was just an extraordinary professional education. So in that sense, it was real luck and timing. Timing, I went to the Rangers. luck I went to the 52nd and Hemp.
Man,
Long answer to your question.
No, it's great. I wonder, just because people don't yet know how much experience you're going to go on and have. I mean, this is just the beginning of a lot of your fighting career. So to say that this person was so influential in helping you become a battlefield leader and teaching you is very important here.
You know, I'd never been in combat before.
Yeah. So,
you know, I had no idea what to expect. And, you know, I could just as easily have gotten involved with some doofus organization, you know, and got myself killed. So, you know, it's luck and timing.
So correct me if I'm wrong, you were assigned there to be an advisor, but really you were kind of soaking up whatever learning you could. How did you manage that relationship, knowing what this person brought in terms of experience?
Well, kind of all of the above. The term advising is a misnomer. We didn't advise him on anything. I mean, he forgot more than I ever knew. But what we did bring is all the American goodies.
Yeah.
I mean, I was basically a forward air FAC. I was an artillery FO. I was the coordinator for any U.S. units we were with, primarily the 11th ACR and the Australians down at Nui Dot, 9th ID, and then, of course, a bunch of them during TEP. So, you know, my job was to get his instructions as to where they're going and how they're going to get there. And then I would plot the artillery, the TAC air, the follow-on support, any coordination with adjacent U.S. units. And they liked work. The U.S. guys liked to work with the Rangers because they were actually good.
Yeah.
Particularly the 11th ACR. We did a lot of joint operations together and we loved them. I mean, they shot 155s, big bullets, and they had tanks and ACABs, you know, and all the things that the Vietnamese army really didn't have. Plus they had chow. You know, they flew in supplies and they treated the Rangers just like their own guys. You know, they didn't ask questions. They just, hey, you're in with us. You're in the perimeter. Here, get fed. You know, it was, and of course the Vietnamese loved it. We got some M60s from the regiment. Colonel Cobb, the regimental commander, gave them to us for helping him out on an ambush. Excuse me. And they never had that before. We were armed with the M1s, the carbines, and the BARs, you know, ancient stuff from Guadalcanal. And, you know, we eventually accumulated better firepower, and primarily because of our association with the U.S. units. I didn't do any commanding at all. Didn't have to. If we got in a deep scrape, yeah, they knew, you know, I would tell them what to do as best I could. But that wasn't my job, and I never really had to do that. My job was to bring in all the assets and the goodies.
Yeah. So with that in mind, in that first tour, do you recall the first time you kind of went outside the wire into combat, or maybe one of the first engagements that you found yourself in?
Yeah, in fact, it was probably within a week of when I joined the 52nd. We were sent down to the Rung Sat, which is this big, huge bayou area, if you would, kind of the Okefenokee swamp of Vietnam. And it's all mangrove and little islands throughout. It connects the Saigon River essentially with the Delta. And it was a favorite transit point for VC supplies. And so we were sent down there and to interdict these little islands full of supplies, caches, the bad guys, you know, whatever we could find down there, rooted out. So they put us on these Vietnamese, call it amphib boats, which were basically fishing boats, V bottoms, and was like a squad in each boat because of the size, and they spread us out. And the nature of the Rung Sat is you go 50 feet, you can't see anybody else. You know, it's all these little kind of curlicue bayous and streams and all. And we each had a little AO that we go to and check all these little islands and bogs. And about the third time, and this is like 9 o'clock in the morning, we dropped on this little place, and it was an island, maybe 10 acres at best, jungly. And we're walking along. I'm about 20 feet behind the point. And all of a sudden, bang, bang, bang. I'm stupid. I don't know what's going on. I want to see. I run up front to the point guys, and they're all firing like crazy. And all of a sudden, this shape comes zipping up across my front, about 20 meters in front of me. Big shock of black hair. And I just snapshot. I mean, it wasn't an aim shot. It was just reaction, pure reaction. Bang, bang, like that. And, we didn't know what happened. So the Rangers continue to pour fire down. We get at the top of the hill and stop. What's going on? Where are we? Consolidate here. And one of the Rangers points down to the bottom of the hill, which bottom of the hill being like 15 meters away. And there's this body crumpled up at the bottom of the hill. And so we all three of us kind of cautiously went down there. And I shot this guy right off the back of the head. Pure snapshot. No consciousness whatsoever. It just happened. Pure reaction. And I can remember to this day looking at that body totally dispassionately. It's like I just shot a deer. I kind of look at it. What does this look like? Okay, move on. That was it. That was my very first contact.
Wow. So just to get this straight, this guy just kind of ran through your lines on his own.
Oh, yeah, he was a VC.
Yeah.
He was armed and he was putting up a rear guard action so his guys behind him could get out of the way. And he just tried to stay one terrain feature ahead of us. We were kind of on the low side of the hill initially, and he came bounding across just so you could see the top of his head. He had this big black hair thing that just went foosh. I can close my eyes and see his head today.
And
never lost a moment's sleep over it.
No, I was going to say, did you grow up hunting? Like, as you mentioned, it could have been a deer.
I've been, we live out in the country on a ranch near Los Padres National Forest. And I've had a weapon in my hand probably since I was 8 years old. First of all, a 22, and then a shotgun for quail. Then I had a deer rifle, 12, I guess, a 30-30 carbine. So yeah, I've been hunting all my life.
Yeah. I wonder, as we look at that first tour and then we juxtapose it, I believe I know you end up being a company commander, an infantry company commander in your second go round.
Yeah, Delta First 50 Deuce up in the Yashao.
Okay. So I'm curious if you think you would have been as prepared for that deployment if you had been a kind of a typical platoon leader in your first one, as opposed to this advisor position.
No, I was far better prepared as a company commander because of my experience. The advantage in being with the Rangers was that, first of all, I was at a battalion level, so you could see how things played out with the subordinate units. Because I was a battalion, I also got the interface with all these senior US elements and the Vietnamese, so I could see and understand how they thought and worked. I could operate a full battalion's lift of helicopters. I knew how to organize it. And of course, with HEP, I certainly knew how to maneuver. He was very clear. You want to avoid contact, do this. You want to make contact, do that. And all sorts of little lessons. And so I went into the company and I was totally prepared to run the place.
God. Yeah, you pretty much got a lesson in leadership from somebody who had been fighting there for what, 10, 15 years?
20 plus.
20 plus, as opposed to potentially being an individual augmentee, or maybe not at that time, but like going into a unit and maybe having a year or two's worth of experience.
If I had been a platoon leader, I would have operated most of my tour as a platoon leader. I wouldn't have gotten a chance to see the larger picture, and I would have been subject to the whims of quality of the US leadership. I could have gotten a real dud as a company commander, or an idiot as a battalion commander, and learned nothing other than survival. This was very educational. It was kind of the Army War College in the jungle.
Yeah, I love it. So I hate jumping forward this fast, but there's so much in your career I want to touch on. So I hope people will excuse me for now, like jumping to tour number 2. But Keith, if there's something we should come back to, you just let me know. But I want to kind of understand, like, that's a big role, being a company commander in combat at that time. Could you talk us through like how you were preparing going in after that first tour and what you learned? Like, what were you taking from American doctrine? What were you taking from what you had learned in that first tour?
Well, first of all, I got to backtrack a little bit. You'll excuse me.
Yeah, please.
What you learn in combat. On the 24th of June in 1967, I was a deputy advisor to the 52nd. Al Shine was the senior advisor. And we were dropped into this LZ way north in the Dong Nai River up in War Zone D. Supposed to be chasing a company base, VC company base camp. Well, the whole thing was basically a premeditated ambush. We ended up with 2 regiments. We landed with about 450 Rangers. 12 hours later, back at our original LZ, we had 32 people left in the perimeter. Give you an example of the intensity of the action. What it taught me is a very karmic approach to combat. Number one, you can't control anything. You can control yourself, and that's it. There's nothing you can do that's going to determine that you will or will not survive. And the Vietnamese understood that. You know, one of them told me, I'm going home in 12 months. They're not going home ever unless they're dead. And their attitude was just do your job. Don't worry about it. You know, when things go bang, you go bang. Take care of the issue, do your best that you can, and don't think about anything. That's the key thing. Don't think about anything, just do. And that served me extremely well in the A-Shell. Delta, I took over the company.
I'm sorry, Keith, don't jump forward on that. That sounds like a pivotal day. So if you want, like, I'd love to hear more about that particular, I don't know if it was a day or a 2-day event.
Well, it's of course written in my book, Just Another Day in Vietnam, in detail. But the bottom line is Chu Hoi came in. That's the guy, VC, I surrender, you know, and then he flipped allegedly. And so he said, hey, I just came from this new VC company base camp that they're building up at this location, blah, 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 blah. And, you know, they're going to bring in a whole company of VC in the course of the next month, and we're still building it, et cetera. And so the 18th Division, who owned the Rangers at this time, total soup sandwich organization, complete politico general. He had the mission, but he just gave the mission to us. He wasn't going to send any of his troops on this sort of deal. So anyway, we grabbed this guy and we do the big plan. We're working, it's going to be done with the 11th ACR. We're going to land and move up toward the base camp. The 11th ACR is going to come in the back door and provide support and blocking forces for us. So the next morning, we have, like, I've never seen so many helicopters in my life. It's like 40 Hueys just came in, you know, stream after stream, lifted the entire battalion in about 2 lifts into this LZ, which was about 1.5 kilometers short of this alleged base camp. We go, this is like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We go up there and suddenly, bam, majoring, you know, bang, bang, bang. And over to my side was the edge of the base camp. And I can remember to this day, a VC firing directly at me. I could see the big cone on the AK-47. And again, you know, a snapshot, I fired three rounds automatic, like that. It was this big explosion. Anyway, my counterpart, the battalion executive officer, grabs me and we start running right at the base camp, right into the base camp. And all the Rangers are firing, you know, and it's very exciting. And we stop, bam. We're 2/3 of the way into this brand new base camp, and it's a base camp. I mean, it's zigzag trenches, great big catty corner bunkers, 51 cows popping at us from the far end, and just this wall of fire. And so we're basically dropped right in the trenches. And Hap later said in the course of the evening, he had no choice other than to assault. If he had not assaulted, the VC would have come out and grabbed us in the open ground and we'd have been dead. So his solution was to assault them. And, we didn't know what the size of the base camp was. We were told it was a company. So we assaulted into it, being a battalion. Well, it was obviously a lot more than that. And over the course of the night, they brought in basically 2 regiments in this very narrow ground. We had it was an oxbow at the Dong Nai and a big stream on the other side banked with this no pass bamboo stuff, very thick thorns. And, we were just locked in. Hep and Shine were over kind of in the center. I was over on the right flank with Sergeant Swires, my RTO. And we knew we were in for a long night. I mean, there were just shadows coming. It was bang, bang, bang all night. And finally, Shine had arranged for, we were clearly in deep kimchi. And Matt V finally woke up and discovered that they were going to lose a Ranger Battalion if they didn't do something in a hurry. Meanwhile, the VC had very artfully ambushed the 11th Cav on a ford down to our south, and they couldn't come through. So we knew we were on our own beginning about midnight. And then at first light, Shine brought in tactical air. We had 72 TAC airstrikes in 45 minutes. And the deal was we just went from crater to crater. It was boom. And then you ran to that crater. And then it was boom. And you ran to that crater.
Wait, sorry, Keith, why did you run to the crater?
It was the only protection we had. If we had gotten out of the crater, they'd have whacked us. They were trying to pursue us, but they couldn't because of the bombs that were going off. The bombs kept them at a reasonably safe distance. 2 things, you start asking me questions, things spring to my mind. The first one was when I first looked up, there was a little square opening in the canopy. And I looked up and there was this Canberra bomber, and they're very distinctive, B-57. They're short, square wings, shiny aluminum. And he had just pickled his bombs right over us. I mean, he probably flew maybe 100 feet over my head. And I'm looking in the skylight there, and I see the air brakes pop out. And I'm looking at these 2 big bombs right over me, and the air brakes pop. And I'm thinking, oh shit, they're coming right down on me. But they didn't, they propelled themselves on ahead.
Wow.
But we followed that bomb line until the VC finally broke contact with us. We got now back at the original perimeter, original LZ, and Shine asked me to check the perimeter and see what we had. And so I did that. And I came back to him and I said, including us, I got 32 people left in the perimeter. And there was Hep, this great image of him sitting on a log, pulling on a pell-mell, looking at his map, figuring out how he was going to counterattack. I mean, that was the guy's mentality. We eventually got back about 150, but that was what was left of us. And it was an exciting day. That's a long story to get started on Delta Worst 502s.
Yeah. Just at the end of that day or the next day, when you got back to some place relatively safe, what was the emotion like for you at that time?
Well, first of all, we wanted to know what happened. How did this happen to us? What was the intel? Where did things go wrong? Well, the 18th Division commander tried to distance himself from the whole thing. He had a regiment that was in a position to support us and didn't. They just sat there overnight, like maybe 500 yards from us. We could hear them, but they wouldn't join us despite Hep's requests. They please do join us. And then, what we eventually got, and this is where the story is, in December of that year, December 67, the VC released 8 prisoners, 8 Rangers that they'd taken prisoner back to, our side as a humane gesture, et cetera. Well, Hep interviewed each one of these guys. He was extremely suspicious. You know, these guys are just flip commies now. But he interviewed each one of them with me present for some of them. And what came out of this whole ambush was a preconceived deal at the highest level. The Cosman wanted to make a public statement by wiping out an elite Vietnamese military unit, whichever one they could find first, airborne, Rangers, or Marines. They just happened to pick us. And this guy, the character in my book called Who is the VC Chuhoy, was the guy that they used as the bait, if you would. And the prisoners came back individually and told us, you know, that the guards and all, and later some of the senior officers from Cosman, while they were prisoners, just told them, laid out the whole story. This is what we did and how we did it. You guys fell right into the trap. You know, aren't we great? So
okay,
life is luck and timing.
Yeah. Well, take us to the timing for Delta Company then for round 2.
I came into the 101st. This is May 1970, I guess. And I was, well, backstory. Between tours, I was sent to the infantry advanced course. That was for captain's career course. So I went there and I arrived, you know, went through the drill, and then it was time for orders, the pink slips day we get from mil percent. I pull out my orders and they're to be an advisor. I want to go back and command American troops. So the major, who is the officer that delivered, you don't need to be you don't need to command U.S. troops, you know, your advisory tour counts, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
I knew that was pure bullshit. And so I said, hey, I want to command U.S. troops. And he said, well, you can't. I said, okay, I want to see the head of, you know, mil percent that's down with you. We're head of professional development, H. Norm Schwarzkopf.
No way.
Lieutenant Colonel. So I troop up to his office and knock on the door, and he's very rotund, you know, he turns around in the chair and he looks up at me. He says, what do you want, Captain? And I said, sir, I got orders to MACV. I was an advisor once. I want to command U.S. troops in combat. You know, as the professional development officer, it's important. And he looked up at me and he said, Captain, I'm in charge of professional development. I'll tell you what's important and what's not. This interview is over.
Wow.
Okay. So what I then do, being stubborn, I go up to the commandant's office. The assistant commandant is Brigadier General Sidney B. Berry, soon to be commanding general, 82nd Airborne Division. So I said, sir, I've got orders to go to Vietnam as an advisor. I want to command U.S. troops in combat. And he looked at me, he said, give me your orders. Give me the orders. Okay, we'll get back to you. Going. Next morning at my house, I get this phone call. I can recognize the voice as the major who told me I couldn't go as a U.S. officer, as a U.S. commander. And he said, are you a volunteer for Vietnam?
Oh, God.
Yes. And he slammed the phone down. Bam. Got orders, 101st. And a letter from Sidney Berry saying, you take this and the personnel officer when you land and give it to him when you show up. And it was, you know, from Berry saying, assign me to a rifle company.
Jeez.
So I go through the drill. I land at Cameron. I go up to Phu Bai, which was the base camp. And I'm going through the processing, and these warrant officers, I did not present the letter initially. I held it off because he just took my file and went off and said, okay, you're going to go to division headquarters as a umpty-ump staff officer. I said, no, I'm not. And he kind of looked at me, you know, like that. And I said, I'm going to command a rifle company. He says, who told you that? And I pulled out Barry's letter and he gave it to him. He said, okay, this changes things. All right. So, but you got to go to CERTS, the Screaming Eagle Replacement Training School, for 1 week before you can go. Okay. So I got my bags and my duffel and I'm going to the CERTS school, and I drop it on the hooch. And I'm no sooner sitting on the edge of my cot ready to unload my stuff. Then there's a Jeep comes running out. Is there a Captain Nightingale? Captain Nightingale? Yeah, Nightingale here. Get in the Jeep. So hey, but I got to go to certs. I've been told I got to spend a week in bullshit. Get in the Jeep. So okay, I get in the Jeep and I arrive at the 50 Deuce Battalion CP rear detachment, run by a guy we called the Raging Cajun. He was about 5'8" and had these lifts on his jungle boots, and he's always screaming, which is why they called him that.
Anyway, an officer, Keith, or no?
Oh yeah, he was a major.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I missed that.
He was the XO. And so he said, we just had a company wiped out and you're to take over the command group. Okay, wonderful. Great way to learn, to get integrated into the unit. Well, I didn't have anything. I had no ammo, no food, just the very basics. So one of these supply sergeants sort of took pity on me and basically packed up my ruck with everything that I would need and all the extras and the ammo. And he said, you want a 45? And I said, no, I want an M16. He said, good choice. So he gave me an M16 and, we spent about an hour loading up mags and all that. They fly me out toward the A Shao, and it's way out it's on the eastern slopes. And it was super green. I can remember to this day getting up off of Fubai and getting up in the clear. You could see miles. It was like a giant, IMAX theater view. And we zooming around and finally see this little spiral of yellow smoke coming up, a LZ about the size of a dime. And anyway, the bird can't fly in. He's got to do a vertical drop, and he hovers over the trees and comes down. He gets about 3 feet off the ground, and the crew chief just kind of pushes me in the back. But the whole ruck and me and helmet go wham, bam, and then all of the guy, he does a full power lift and goes out, and I'm just covered with all this shit. And I get up, and this is D Company, 1st 50 Deuce. They had about 65 people left out of 120.
No way.
They were just totally wiped out. I mean, psychologically, you could see it. RTO came over to me, black kid from Birmingham, Alabama, super smart, and said, okay, sir, this is the deal. And he's very calm. He explained to me what had gone on the night before, and, what they had and all that. And so that was my introduction to Delta 1st 50 Deuce.
On that, did they drop you at a patrol base, or was that your FOB?
That was the independent FOB of the company.
Wow.
Basically, it was basically a small perimeter. It was a perimeter of the company's perimeter.
Yeah. So where to start? I mean, you just mentioned what happened in your first tour. You're dropped off in this scenario. And I think later we're going to get to what a lot of people refer to as Desert One. Seems like these moments where you're having to build morale back up. What do you do in that situation? Like, you're literally just in country. They've never met you before, and they just got wiped out the night before.
Well, you have to go back to my early teachings in B Company 2505. This is 1966, the summer of 66. And the company had a lot of World War II vets. The division commander, battalion commanders, a lot of the NCOs were World War II vets. Amongst them, in my particular company, B2505, commanded by Clancy Matsuda, we had only one other officer, and that was Hugo Sueros, who was a Cuban that had been liberated from the Bay of Pigs. Hugo didn't speak English very well, so they made him the XO, so he could basically do the paperwork. So I was the platoon leader for 4 platoons. 2 of them were commanded by ex-Wehrmacht NCOs. They had joined the 82nd, the 505, as part of something called Operation Gyroscope when the division was in Germany, when the regiment was in Germany. This was a citizenship deal. You know, you join the 505, blah, blah. So that's what they were. Super professional. All four of them went out of their way to train me how to be an officer. They would never let me make a mistake. They would always rehearse me and pre-train me before I got in front of a soldier. Okay, sir, mounting of the guard. This is what you're going to do. This is what I'm going to do.
Wow.
These are the questions you're going to ask. Do you understand, sir? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And I do. Tell me what I just told you. You know, they refuse to let you do something stupid.
Can I ask you just one question, Keith? I feel like you make it sound like you lucked into these things, but it almost, I would imagine you have to be, people need to know you're open to something like this. Were you seeking this out, like this type of instruction, support, development?
But it was, I never, you know, like I said, I grew up on a ranch. I've been working since I was a kid with, you know, all the Bracero folks and everybody else. And I never intentionally tried to pull rank or take a position on it. You know, I said, what are we going to do? You know, like that, what are we going to do? And, you know, they tell me what we're going to do.
Got it. Yeah.
So, you know, it was, I always knew I was in charge. They always knew I was in charge, but it was never a point.
Yes.
You know?
Love it. Okay. Sorry to interrupt. Please keep going. Very interesting.
So at any rate, the first night I was really in the field with 2505. I went with one of the ex-Wehrmacht NCO platoon sergeants, and he said, "Follow me, sir." And he was a classic Hollywood Central casting Nazi. I mean, he had the blonde hair, the blue eyes, the square chin, the whole thing. But he wasn't. But he looked the part, you know. So anyway, he took me around. He said, "Sir, just follow me." And so he would take me to each one of the positions, and he would ask these guys real basic questions. Okay, what are your right and left limits? Do you have a grenade sump here? Who's on your left? Who's on your right? Where's the CP to the rear? You know, what are your fields of fire? You know, and he would go through this kind of little litany of professional questions for the guys that were in a particular position. And he went through the whole platoon that way. So by the time we were through, I basically knew what it took to run an infantry platoon and, you know, the questions to ask. So I wasn't stupid. You know, I could go into a hole and say, okay, show me your left limit. You know, what's out there at 100 yards? Wow. And I remember that very, very implicitly, obviously. So I landed in this group out in the boonies. They've all been wiped out. And I can see by looking at them, they're catatonic. I'm also looking at my watch and seeing it's about to get dark in the A-Shao. And, you know, you can get in trouble in a hurry out there. So I had to figure out a way to kind of recoup them psychologically to where they kind of regain their sense of professionalism for survival, if nothing else. And you could see they were whacked. I mean, they were just kind of like this. Some were smoking cigarettes, you know, other guys were just kind of hanging on. We still had the bodies in the craters in front of us. You know, the flies were buzzing all around. Great atmospherics. You had up above, they had some old stains from napalm that didn't work, you know, and craters around the place. My CP was full of discarded medical stuff, 2 shot up PRC 25s from the previous company commander, and just, you know, a junkyard, which is what combat is all about. It's just junk. Any rate, I knew, hey, no rah-rah speech is going to work here. You know, this isn't going to be a football locker room drill. So what I did, I just did what the German did. I went to each of the positions and asked them the basic questions. Okay, you know, where's your left limit? Where's your right limit? How many grenades you got here? You got your ammo out? You know, your buddy here, where's he going to be? What's his PDF going to be? Anyway, I just went around the perimeter. It took me about an hour, but you could see kind of a spark of life return to them. And so that's what it was on my very first day. The next day, I was a little more conversational, but I kept the work. The battalion wanted me to make a very aggressive move. And I said, I didn't think these guys are ready for it yet. but we can accomplish what you want us to do, which is basically cloverleaf searching, and find anything, if there is anything to be found out there. I kept the 3 platoons very close together before they had been kind of spread out, which is what got them in trouble in the first place. We got essentially almost defeated in detail. And so I knew from my experience with HEP that dispersal is a bad idea in country you don't know. And so I pulled them back, and I essentially used the company in column. We would go to an area, I'd look on the map that was kind of reasonable in terms of distance, go there, stop, set up an NDP, and we had a training exercise where I used the technique that we had used in the 52nd, which was essentially a triangle. You got 3 platoons. So HEP did it with 3 companies, put a regular triangle with machine guns at the point, and that's pretty tight perimeter. It's mutually supporting. Everybody can kind of see each other, so they get a little psychological Benny there. And I just had them drill it a couple times in this area in the A-Show, and that's what we used from then on. And they liked it because they could see the value of it. I was supposed to have 140 men. I don't think I ever went to the field with more than 185. And sometimes it was down to the low 70s. That includes the Kit Carson scouts, the dog handlers, you know, and the FO party.
So the whole time you're basically at half strength, effectively.
Yes.
Jeez. What?
Not unusual.
Yeah.
I wasn't the Lone Ranger there.
Do you recall, or did you have any other officers there, platoon leaders, or were they part of that?
Yeah, I actually had platoon leaders, and they ranged from very good to absolutely total cowards. Give you an idea of the mental mindset of what was going on at the time. Lieutenant Fox, a Berkeley grad, if you would, superb soldier. I could give him a mission order and he would go off and he would just do wunderbar. Never any problem. I had this other guy come in and we got him to firefight, and he'd been in the company about a week. And we got in this firefight and everybody's going bang, bang, grenades running, charging. And I go over to his platoon area and the guy is wrapped up in a fetal position behind a tree. And I grabbed the platoon sergeant and said, "What the fuck's going on here with this guy?" He said, "Sir, forget about it." We go on to do whatever needed to be done. Things get consolidated. This guy is still, he's just whimpering like a baby behind the tree. And so I say, "What's the deal here?" So I go, you know, almost incoherent. So I called the battalion up and I say, "I have an officer here who's a coward. I want to relieve him. I want you to pick the guy up and get him out of my perimeter." Bang, just like that. Okay, well, this is Dragon 3, wait out. Okay, blah, 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 time hack. Okay. Musty Races 6, this is Dragon 6. What's your problem? So I got a coward here, the lieutenant. He just is a total ball. He is incapable of performing his job. Said, "This Dragon 6 is your problem. Work it out."
Wow.
So that was it. And from then on, I was the platoon leader of that platoon in addition to the company. He just went along for the ride. You know, the battalion was just not interested in dealing with that sort of thing, which is the mindset at that time. Barry was totally different. We were out, we opened up a place called Firebase Rifle, which was on QL5, I think, toward the A-Show from the Fubai Plain. And it was miserable. It was a monsoon. And, you know, we were on a 4-day ration cycle, 4-day log cycle, which we missed once, twice. We're now down there. We're at there about 9 days, and we on our original 4-day log, and everybody's starving, and the mud is everywhere. You know, we're trying to dig, and it's pouring rain, just completely soaked. And nobody had visited us at all. There'd been no log whatsoever. And all of a sudden, this is like 8 o'clock in the morning. I listen, I hear this whop, 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 whop. And flying in on the pavement, about 1 foot off the deck, was this helicopter. And it comes in and it finally sees us and drops down. I mean, there's like 20 feet in front of me, so that's how close it was. The fog was so dense. Out of the helicopter pops Barry. He flew the sucker, and he was in immaculate starch fatigues, and the jungle boots and all that. And he comes up, "How you doing, Keith?" Blah, 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 blah. Said, "What do you got going here?" And I said, "Well, this is what we got going, blah, blah, blah." And he said, I said, we had no log in the last, we've missed 2 log days now. The guys are really, kind of at the end. We were all smoking cigarettes and chewing the last of the M&Ms. That was it. And he said, "Okay, show me what you're doing." And he went around, excuse me, to every position, got in the mud. And, he was just like everybody else. He wanted to talk to the troops, see what they were doing, how they were doing it. And he came back and he was coated in chocolate, the whole thing. And he said, "Okay, very educational." And he indicated to his aide, and the aide went back into the helicopter and brought out 2 big silver bullets of coffee and a big box of Swiss Miss. And he said, this is my gift to you. You should be getting some help shortly." And then he just did a 180 and went back down the road. Within 2 hours, I had the brigade commander, the battalion commander, and the S4 all flying out to make sure that we were fine.
Wow.
It gives you an example of kind of the leadership of that time.
Jeez. I feel bad leaving the Vietnam story behind here, but there are a couple other things I definitely want to touch on. One of those, which was something I didn't understand, and I was hoping you could help explain. And I know people with Ranger backgrounds will know the lineage, but one of the things I came across was that you helped stand up, I think it was 1st Battalion of the 75th in 74. I just assumed that it had been there for years before.
No.
Could you explain what that was like?
In 1973, when we got out of Vietnam, the Army was totally on its ass. Officers didn't know how to officer. The NCO Corps had been totally decimated because of Vietnam. The troops were in revolt. I mean, we had the black issues, we had the frag issues, we had the drug issues, you name it, we had the issues, and nobody knew what to do. The Army couldn't fight its way out of a wet paper bag. So Abrams, this overweight, cigar smoking leg officer, chief of staff of the Army, says, "We got to do something to regenerate what the Army is all about. And I'm going to create a Ranger Battalion. And the Ranger Battalion is going to be the finest light infantry unit on the planet. And it will be obvious to everybody that it is the finest light infantry unit on the planet." He then selected Lieutenant Colonel Lure to be the 1st Battalion commander. Lure had commanded a battalion in the 101st when I was there. And we had met briefly in Da Nang when I turned over the Da Nang ASP to him. At any rate, we come back, and we all separately come back from Vietnam. And I see in the paper, Army Times, they're going to create this Ranger Battalion, and Colonel Lure is going to be in charge. And so I pick up the phone and I say to Milpercent, the great Milpercent, and I say, "Hey, I want to join this Ranger Battalion." The guy laughs at me. He said, "You spent your entire career in the Army in field units. You got to spend some time on staff, suffer." And I said, "Well, let me say it again. I want to go to the Ranger Battalion." He said, "No way," hangs up the phone. So what then I do is I call up Colonel Lure and I say, "Sir, I would like to command in the Ranger Battalion." And he says, "Stand by," hangs up the phone. Next day, same major for Milpercent. "Are you a volunteer for the Ranger Battalion?" "Yeah, I sure am." Bang. Orders now to Fort Benning. I was one of the original cadre for the 1st Ranger Battalion. Wow. And so that's how we started the whole thing. The idea at the time was that we would build a model. The Rangers initially were designed to be a model organization. This is how you train. This is what you develop. This is where your focus is. And once we got all that settled out, we would then migrate the NCOs and enlisted and the officers from the Ranger Battalion to the rest of the Army. And they would take all this new bright stuff, which was that very basic old stuff, and they would make the Army as a whole better. That was the whole concept, which went on for a while until special ops came in, and that basically put a freeze on the whole idea. But that was the model behind 175.
I mean, I think even today you still have people who rotate in and out from an officer perspective out of the battalion.
Yes, that's correct.
You still get the learnings shared, I think.
Yes. To be a platoon leader or a company commander, you had to serve successfully in another unit in that same position. And the NCOs for a long time were rotated out. And then when the special ops stress began, they were essentially frozen in place. So they might go from 1st Battalion to 2nd Battalion to 3rd Battalion, but they didn't go into Mother Army unless they said, I want out, or they were fired.
Okay. So this is fascinating. If you can, I mean, you were there at the beginning of what we know today as the Ranger, like this type of Ranger Battalion. And they have been since then, like the premier light infantry.
Right.
Did you and the other commanders sit down in a room and, hey, here's the type of thing we have to do, brainstorm? Or like, did Abrams say, this is what it's going to look like? How did you come up with the tactical?
Abrams left it totally up to Luhr to figure out what it was going to look like. He got some minimal guidance from General Depew, who at that time was a TRADOC commander, which basically was, you're going to have a creed. That was very important, that there be a creed. And so that became a significant task for the officers and senior NCOs to figure out what that ought to look like. But the bottom line is, how do we train? How do we organize? That was left totally up to Luhr. And what Luhr did is he tasked each of the company commanders to do an historical study of some particular organization. I got the British Commandos. Rokas got something else. Barnhill got something else. Clark got something else. And this was while we were at Fort Benning. We had like 32 people in total cadre.
Wow.
So we did all this study about how do you make units good. We went back to the World War II techniques, from Gavin and Ridgway and all the things that they had talked about. It had to be light infantry. And then at the same time, Luhr had discovered something called performance-oriented training, which was actually a commercial business training system developed by this guy at, I think, Florida State. And Luhr actually had the guy come up and lecture us on what performance-oriented training was. And it was initially designed to show businesses how their business really worked in terms of like assembly line production. Now you got the widget, now you got this, and then you put it in that, and then it goes to there. And so what it was breaking down all of the tasks from individual up to the higher collective. And so he walked us through how you might do that from an infantry viewpoint. Individual, squad or individual in the attack. What do you do? Well, this is your equipment. This is your task. These are the conditions. And this is your standard for passage. If PFC Schmuck has all this done, he's ready to go into the attack. Machine gun squad. What do you do? Well, you do X, Y, Z, measurable standard. And Luhr was really big on that. There had to be a measurable standard. In other words, you could look at something and say, go or no go. It wasn't a subjective sort of thing like the previous evaluation approach was. So he then had us sit down, and he gave each company the task. And this is with the NCOs that we were gathering. Okay, you have attack, you have defend, you have delay, et cetera, airborne operation. And then each of the companies would get together, the NCOs, we'd write it all up on 3x5 cards from individual through company, and we'd stack them all up. And then we would have a murder board on the weekend where we would go over each one of them and we make adjustments and we put it all together. And Jim Montana, who was our S5, was then tasked with taking all of the approved cards and making them into what was the first light infantry RTEC.
Wow.
Another task that we had.
That's cool. How interesting.
What it really did was it focused on the individual in the squad, which is exactly what Ridgway and Gavin said you had to do to make a unit. Ridgway's comment was that all combat is small unit. You can land 140,000 people in Normandy, but it boils down to first squad, first platoon, A company taking a bunker out. Wow. And collectively they either do it or they don't.
So again, I could spend like 3 hours just talking about this, but let's jump to Eagle Claw if you feel like that's an appropriate next step, where I think people don't understand what that is. So I might ask you to explain what Eagle Claw was, your role in it, and then, but correct me if I'm wrong here, Keith, but kind of like the beginning of what we know as JSOC.
Correct. In November of '80, the U.S. Embassy was taken over by the Iranian Guard, the mullahs, et cetera, et cetera. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
IRGC, yeah.
And originally 104 hostages. It was then quickly whittled down to 52. The rest were released for a variety of reasons. JCS has a meeting. And so the chairman, General Jones, says, okay, we got the hostages. What are we going to do? How can we get them out? Well, the answer was we can either send in the 82nd Airborne or we can nuke them. There wasn't anything in between. So Meyer, Chief Staff of the Army, said, we need to have a in extremis force capable of extracting these hostages. I will provide the leader, Major General Vaught, and we will come up with a force to do this. And Carter's guidance was, well, they had to be ready to go in 10 days. Well, we had nothing on, there was no force, there was no headquarters, no nothing. General Vaught was the head of DEMO Des Ops, the director of military operations, the active guys in Des Ops. He was a veteran of Korea. He was actually in the constabulary before that in Austria, and was in special forces and had participated in the chase going after Che Guevara in Bolivia. Just left as CG, the 24th ID at Fort Stewart. Really good soldier. Had a battalion in the 1st Cav during Tet at Hue. Anyway, really good soldier. I was working for him in something called MEAF, Middle East Africa Desk. At that time, there was not a geographical sync for that area, and it was all kind of lumped together. I had to figure out where's the machine gun in Dahomey, and what prince is having dates with another prince, that sort of thing. Which was a fairly low level, low priority deal. NATO was the big deal. Reforger, 4102 and all that. At any rate, Vaught is in London, and they fly him back on a Concorde to join up. And what he does is he takes over JCS SOD, which is a special ops director of JCS. The chief of staff was Jerry King, Army Special Forces guy. The J2 was Rod Lenahan, Air Force Intel guy. And the J3 was Maynard Wires, Navy SEAL, Lieutenant Commander. And the whole staff was like 20 people, including Vaught. So Vaught reaches down to get some help, and I'm just kind of sleeping at the desk. So he says, hey, Nightingale, come on up, you're going to join us. So I joined him, and I stayed there for the rest of the deal. And we built up a force basically from scratch. Went through drills every day. First, intelligence was a driver of everything. We had the overhead shots, we had HUMINT, we had anything that would purport to be of potential intelligence value, Rod Lenahan got. And at the same time, we had all of these briefings and meetings going on. You have to understand that 2C840 is about the size of an enlarged broom closet. It was called tempest proof, which meant it was like a secure skiff. And it was very enclosed, it was very crowded. Our whole building, we finally worked up to 32 people was the staff, which included a Navy yeoman who kind of took care of the front desk stuff. General Vaught, who had kind of a little sidebar phone booth office, then the rest of us in the back room. Had a long conference table, maybe 2 feet wide and 8 feet long. Twice a day, we had a meeting in that conference room table with all of the great and mighty in the Pentagon. Invariably, we would have, of course, the chairman, he was there twice a day. The service chiefs, usually Meyer would attend both, the morning and the afternoon brief. Navy and the Air Force, more spotty, but we always usually had SecDef Brown, Secretary of Defense. We had Brzezinski from the NSC.
Wow. And
usually Ham Jordan coming in, who was kind of Carter's factotum. Anyway, I was the gopher. I was the lowest ranking guy in the room. And so as a result, I got all the gopher details. One of them, which was to make the briefing books for, they had 8 books we had to put together for the service chiefs, the OpDep, and SecDef. And that included everything. What's the weather? Where are the hostages? What do we know that's new? What options do we have on the table? Timeline, any other political or military things that might be of value. And I had to assemble that every morning and every afternoon and trot it around. And then I was charged of the flip charts in the briefings, which my point in all this is it was tremendously educational. I mean, I'm this guy that's been a grunt in the foxhole for my entire life. And suddenly I'm thrust up into the super stratospheric atmosphere. And I'm still a major, and I'm absorbing all this stuff. You know, I'm 2 feet away from the Secretary of Defense. And, you know, the chairman's asking me a question. Well, what do you think? Me? Moi? So I thought, you know, he'd look at me, and he was a great soul. He just said, well, you know, like that. Okay, whatever you think. So I say what I thought. And, you know, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And so we went through all this, the tremendously painful process. The first Special Ops wing, the Air Force, was basically at the total bottom of the Air Force food chain. Half of their airplanes were hangar queens. Their personnel structure was not as magnificent as it might be. They were way off in Mars in terms of the spare parts priority. So they had to be built up. And then we had to start doing a common sense drill on helicopters. We had studied truck infill. We'd studied rail infill. We had studied commercial air infill. You know, how do we get the Delta guys into the compound to rescue the hostages and bring them back? Well, everybody had a bright idea. And so every day we had to basically shoot and eat the bright idea of the moment.
Wow.
Finally, it became real clear that we weren't going to get any help from our allies. You know, they either said, you cannot use our land whatsoever, or you can fly over us, but we don't want to know about it, and you can't land. So it became clearly evident that the only thing that would work was a helicopter insertion from a Navy carrier. Then, of course, all the bright ideas. Well, we need Chinooks, and we can put a lot of fuel on Chinooks and fly them. We'll use Hueys. You know, every general that thought he could fly something would call Meyer with his bright idea. And of course, we had to kill all of those. The big issue being the chairman was extremely sensitive about OPSEC and the Russians. He said there is no way that we can allow the Russians to even think we might be pulling off a rescue. Well, that immediately says, you know, a Chinook on an aircraft carrier doesn't look like what it's supposed to be. a Huey doesn't work. And, in addition to the range issue, the lift, it's just absurd. Army helicopters have no rotor brakes. They don't have blade folding kits. They can't go into the hangar deck. So those were all rejected. And we were flipping through Jane's air power, Jane's fighting airplanes, and went through the whole thing, like 1,000 pages. Finally discovered King Hussein of Jordan had a tricked out RH-53. And this tricked out RH-53, the RH-53 had fighter drop tanks on it. You get up to 1,200 miles. Wow, that's a good idea. So the Navy, we took this to the director of operations, Thor Hansen, who was a Navy guy, and said, does the Navy have anything in its inventory? Well, yeah, sure. All of the RH-53s have wing tanks on them because we want extended time out there. So we had the answer right away. It was an RH-53 with the wing tanks, which, by the way, belongs on an aircraft carrier, so it doesn't look out of place. So at any rate, we now know how we're going to get there, which is the RH-53s. The question then is, well, we can't fly to Tehran and to a extraction airfield even with the extended wing tank. So we have to come up with an interim location that we can fly the helicopters to, where the Air Force SOW can bring in fuel, refuel them to the selected limit, and then onload the Delta guys on the helicopters and go to a drop-off point, which was going to be Desert 2. And at Desert 2, they would be met by our clandestine troops led by Dick Meadows, who had a bunch of Iranians that we had recruited in the States, and some Iranian trucks, covered trucks. They would pick up the Delta guys at Desert 2, drive them into Tehran, and the agency had acquired a warehouse very close to Roosevelt Avenue where the embassy was. And they would stay overnight in the warehouse. And then the next day, about 2 a.m., they would come out, get on the trucks, go along Roosevelt Avenue, breach the compound, clear the hostages, and go across the street to a soccer stadium there, where the helicopters would come in and extract them, and then pull them off to our extraction airfield, a place called Mansouriyah. Mansouriyah was an abandoned airfield that had been used by the US and the Iranians for F-4 training earlier. We saw it, we watched it on overhead, it was unoccupied, it was perfect. So they would go to Mansouriyah, where the only 3 refuelable C-141s in the entire US inventory would be landing, and take them on. The Rangers would blow up the helicopters, everybody would fly off, and life would be wonderful. The evolution of the Rangers is a separate internal issue that we finally had to resolve with Beckwith, because he didn't want them for a variety of reasons. At any rate, that was JTF 1, and when it went down and it failed, the chairman called us all in, like within 24 hours.
Keith, can I just real quick, for people who don't know what happened at Desert 1, right? You get the helicopters make it to the staging area, which is Desert 1. And then you've got the Air Force aircraft that land there. So they're out in the open effectively, and they're getting ready to move into to Desert 2. And then basically you have, I think, 4 helicopters.
We had 5 functional, we needed 6.
That's it.
And the one of the aircraft that landed, we had 6 aircraft that landed, and the BIM light, the blade indicator mechanism on one of the helicopters was flashing as if there had been a compromise, which would cause an immediate grounding. And the plan then was, okay, this is what we're going to do as we had planned previously. We'll just refuel the birds and evacuate back, and we'll do it all again the next night. That was the plan, the abort plan, which was what Jim Kyle, who was the commander at Desert One, requested from Vought, who approved it, with the chairman acknowledging it, and the silence from the president assumes implies consent. So that's what the deal. Okay, abort plan B. Well, at that point, Jim Schaefer picked up his bird and was in the process of moving behind one of the refuel birds when he basically lost his, call it his ground vision, if you would, and he overcorrected with his top rotor blade impacting on the top of the refuelable bird, and boom. And at that point, everything went up in smoke, literally, and we just had to get out of there with everybody.
So it became public at that time, right?
Yes, but it became public about 24 hours later.
Yeah, sorry. So fairly quickly. And then that's the failure you're talking about.
Yeah. And then immediately after, actually before Vought got back from Wadi Kina, the chairman called a meeting with call it the JTF rear. That was me and several other guys, as well as the service chiefs. And he said, hey, look, we're going to have to do this again in extremis. This force has to be reconstituted, and it has to be capable of going off in extremis within 10 days. We're prepared to take casualties, but we're going to extract whatever we can. From now on, the gloves are off. You put down on a piece of plain white paper what you think it's going to need to actually do this. No resource constraints whatsoever, no personnel constraints whatsoever. Put it all together and give it to me within 3 days. And so Vought came back on the day after that. We sat him down with General Meyer, and we came up with this list of what we needed to have and how we needed to do it. On the Army side, Meyer was absolutely adamant there had to be an intelligence support agency. There had to be U.S. Army eyes on a target. We were not going to be hostage to the inability of the CIA to give us the human. So I'm not sending any unit guys against a target unless I have a qualified eyeball first. That was the birth of now ISA. We called it then FOG, Field Operations Group. We need to expand Delta, particularly in their support area and some of their ancillary intelligence capabilities, which we immediately did. We need to have an Army aviation unit that covers all form of aviation, both fixed and rotary. That was the beginning of Task Force 160, the SOAR. We also had a couple other issues I'm not going to discuss, but he came up with this long list. And again, as the gopher, he and Vought put me in charge of the budget. We had no budget. I had to go out now and get with the comptroller of the Army and come up with something like 150 million bucks in the course of like that. Mr. Frank Keenan, great American, and he found it for us through a variety of means. And then we secretly trooped up to the hill because we had some legal issues we had to deal with in terms of procurement and acquisition. And, you know, the FAR regulations were killing us. And so, you know, we had a little package of paperwork, and there were 3 of us that went up to the hill, and we would brief backdoor classified the ranking member, the chairman and the ranking member of the HISIC, CISIC, the hack and the SAC and the HISIC and the CISIC, and no staff, no nothing. Said, sir, this is what we're trying to do. This is what we need from you. We slide them the paper across. They all sign it. You need more? We'll give you more, you know. And so we were in very short order able to create something called, well, we called it Project Honey Badger. which funded the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army special ops programs. And this was the beginning of JSOC. The Holloway board, which was going on concurrently with this, came up with a number of conclusions. One was that there had to be a standing joint task force capable of doing this kind of stuff, because we didn't have that before. That would be JSOC, the new JSOC, and would be commanded by an Army Major General, and it would have a, quote, small staff, which I said is small enough to be dysfunctional staff. They intentionally did not give it enough people to really do anything. It was like total of 100 people for everything.
Wow.
And that was intentional. And there were no assigned forces whatsoever.
Why was that intentional, Keith? Why do you say that?
They didn't want the background to all of this is that the Navy and the Air Force Chiefs of Staff felt that General Jones was running the Iran rescue as kind of his private army.
Got it.
They had just had a very bloody year plus on the Unified Command Plan. The last thing they wanted to have was some independent organization flying in a sink area without the sink being engaged or wanting it or approving it. So their theory was if they keep it at home, that it can't get anybody in trouble. They wrote into the policy that all personnel, operational personnel, could only be assigned after a joint action. Missions can only be assigned after a joint action. Well, you know, in the Pentagon, a joint action can take a year. So it was intentionally ponderous. Meyer tried to assign the Rangers, Delta, and Task Force 160 to JSOC. He was perfectly prepared to give them all up if the Air Force would assign the SOW. The Air Force flat refused. No way we're going to do that.
Wow.
So it died. But what Meyer did do is he just made sure that all those organizations trained as much as possible under General Schultes. So at least Schultes had something to work with. And then because of the honey badger requirements, real world, the SOW was also fully integrated into all this stuff. So even though Schultes didn't have an assigned force capability, he actually had forces working with him for that period of time. But it was very ponderous, very difficult, and the bureaucracy went out of its way to fight the inclusion of these new capabilities in the structure in terms of both personalities and funding. We pulled the rug out of them on funding by our backdoor congressional visits. You know, we would go in there and say, I need $250 million in Army appropriations aviation. And the procurement guy said, no way you can do that, impossible. You know, it's going to be 3 budget years before you even get mentioned. I'd come back with the money in my hand. You know, they're just jaws that drop. How did you do that? You know,
did you ever imagine, like looking back to that time, that it would become this premier organization that it is today?
We had hints of it. What saved JSOC and created SOCOM over every single service chief was world events. There was so much stuff going on: Bader Meinhof, the Red Brigade, the Dozier kidnapping, Achille Lauro, fill in the blank, that there was a constant demand for this sort of capability. And we were constantly doing operational stuff outside of maybe doing a rescue. I mean, the chairman would come in and say, hey, look, we got a problem here with Dozier. You know, how do we get him? Well, we'd start drilling on that. So you got Dozier going on, then you got something going on in Chad, and then you got something going on over here. By the way, we're still trying to rescue the hostages, and we're running all these mega exercises to drill the force on that stuff. And finally, the biggest rock in the road was Bernie Rogers, who was SACEUR. And he was absolutely adamant there would be no special ops, no JSOC
Wow.
coming in his theater, blah, 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 blah. Well, his position was he was going to rely on the special forces, his inclusive special forces, to do all this stuff. Well, they had a real world situation. And our liaison was a guy by the name of Jim McGee, a Marine captain, and then later major, a good friend of mine. And Rogers liked the guy and trusted him implicitly. And the special forces guy said, there's no way we can do this task. It's impossible. And McGee looked at it and he took it back to us and said, yeah, I mean, this is a Delta Ranger deal. And then so we briefed it, and then we went to Rogers and he became an acolyte. Special forces, special ops was now a self-licking ice cream cone as far as Bernie was concerned. And he asked for them. And so we sent guys over there, liaison, pat them on the head and show them what we can do, and little training exercise, make his guys feel better. And, he was on board. The Navy was constantly difficult. The Air Force just wanted money for the blade hours. They'd do anything you gave, you wanted them to do. Yeah. Army, they were full bore, we were 110% behind it. But it was primarily because of the force of personality of Meyer. He just bulldozed things through and gave us incredible authority. I mean, I think back now, what I did as a major, I would be in a firing squad today if anybody had discovered, the stuff that me and a couple other people had done.
I love it. I felt that way when I was at the agency. Like, it would have taken me a long time in the big Army to get to do or see, or be a fly on the wall for some of those things.
Yeah.
So,
well, again, that was the function of the fact that I was the lowest ranking guy.
Yeah.
It was a very small staff, so you could get a decision in a hurry, and you were usually tasked with at least starting the program. So it was incredibly educational. Just like working with HEP, working with Bob was equally educational, but at a much higher level.
It's like you were at a startup amongst other giant tech companies, and like, hey, you only got a certain number of people. Everybody's got to do something. You're going to go up against the big guys.
Exactly. And, I would troop a piece of paper to one of the service chiefs and, fill in a name, and nobody else could know about it. I had this little gold folder, which immediately meant it was promoted only to God. And I would show it to him, and this was something he didn't want to do. And he had made it plain to me before, we don't do that. We aren't going to do that. And then I would give him the piece of paper signed by God that said, you're going to do this. Well, being counseled by a chief of staff of some service, probably at least twice a week, was not a wonderful experience.
So I promised I wouldn't take you that long. I want to leave people on a bit of a cliffhanger, and that has to do with Pablo Escobar. And I don't even know how to approach this with you. I mean, you play such an important role in that operation that is joint to the max when we talk about the different services and agencies that are involved. Could you just tell, for the people who aren't familiar, who is Pablo Escobar? And then if you could tell us just briefly, like maybe one of the more interesting moments you found yourself in related to Pablo.
Pablo Escobar ran probably one of the world's most successful and professional drug operations in the world. He was the CEO of Drugs 101, if you would.
Yeah.
Kind of the Jeff Bezos of the drug industry. Working out of Medellin, he killed and blew up his way to primacy in the drug world. Was responsible for the vast majority of the coke and the heroin that went from Latin America into the United States and elsewhere. He became prime target of called international drug control. General Thurman, who was the head of Sync South, he's the one that flipped over Noriega, created an organization called DDN, doesn't mean anything, but it was the Counter Drug Task Force. And I was the in charge of it. Commander is a different, difficult use, is not a correct euphemism in that particular environment. I had DEA, CIA, NSA, Customs, all the services and Coast Guard in this little room. And our job was to track and assist, quote unquote, in the interdiction, both land, sea, and air of drugs coming in from Latin America. And it quickly became an Escobar personality issue. He had killed one of the leading presidential candidates during the Colombian election. And that kind of suddenly made him beyond the pale from the Colombian viewpoint. They had tolerated him up to this point because if they didn't, he'd shoot him. So this force was created with, I would call it, interagency cooperation. Coordination is a little too difficult. I would say cooperation, and cooperation was based on the personality of whatever department you were working with.
Wow.
And the primary players were DEA, CIA, and this DDN organization, and off to a side, JSOC. And the mission was to figure out how to get the Colombians competent enough and with a backbone to knock off Pablo. That was basically it in a nutshell. And so after quite a bit of study, we, and I say we as the interdepartmental DOD, DOJ, figured out the way to do it is to create a homegrown Colombian organization with trustworthy people. That's a tough nut to follow there. And that is the outgrowth of what became the search block. The search block was run by Colonel Fernandez from the police, totally incorruptible. And we built a big compound for him out in the boonies because before, all of his policemen, all the policemen were living interurban, just like they do in our own cities. And so the bad guys would figure out what cop was giving him a hard time. They go visit the family, bang, bang. Well, pretty soon all the cops are pretty friendly with the bad guys. Only way to solve that was to isolate them and their families from the bad guys, which is what the search block compound did. Then it became an issue of training the membership. This is where the unit came in, as well as special forces. We had contingents down there operating independently that trained the Colombian special ops forces and their security police. The unit guys were training the search block folks. Same time, NSA was coming up with toys and goodies. And we had this overarching intelligence program operating out of my office that basically stripped Pablo's program naked. And we would find particular weak points, and then we would point the search block toward those points. Our biggest stumbling block was Joe Toft and DEA. They wanted nothing to do with this because they were afraid DOD was going to take over the counter drug program and they'd lose all their money and their purpose in life. So he was perpetually difficult. But the program was so large and so significant that we were able to overcome it. It became a political thing. The vice president was very much involved. The president asked enough pointed questions to where DEA had to be somewhat supportive. And in other cases, we just didn't tell DEA what we were going to do before the search block was given the target list. And then the search block would go off and do its thing. Well, it was sort of an initial training exercise. You started way outside in Medellin. You popped a couple guys here and things got a little more nervous. You monitored the traffic and you could tell somebody was getting nervous. Then you go pop some more and then start really getting nervous. Well, over the course of a year, all of Pablo's support structure was whittled down to a very few amount of people. And finally, the search block was able to narrow him down to a certain apartment complex because he was talking to his son on his cell phone when they nailed him. and we were watching the whole thing overhead.
Wow.
I was overhead. I was in Panama at our ops center watching the whole thing from a customs FLIR that was over, watching the whole thing go down. We could monitor the radio nets, and then we could, of course, see visually what was going on. And we also had the intel going on, so we could hear the chatter from the bad guys all at the same time. Just like great movie. It would have been a great movie.
Yeah. Was there like one piece of intel that really broke it open for you guys along the way?
No, what it was constantly thinning the onion ring of his defense.
Got it.
He eventually ran out of people that were loyal to him because they could look around and see that their guys got popped. The search block was, as difficult as Pablo was. They didn't mind shooting people. And so that had an effect.
Wow. So there's so much we didn't even scratch the surface on. So I hope people get the book. There's just so much to dig into about you and your background, Keith. I'm so appreciative of your time. There's 2 questions I try to ask everybody. So if you'll do me the honor, when you were in combat, and this could be Vietnam or any of the other operations you ended up being on, was there anything you carried with you into combat that had sentimental value, a good luck charm, or something that somebody gave you?
Yeah, it was a big knife, a buffalo skinner knife that my aunt had given me, and I was about 14. My mother's family's from Toronto. And so I was out shopping with her one day, and we saw this big Bowie knife in the window of this 99-cent store. So I looked at it and said, I want that. And so she picked it up reluctantly because, she was my aunt, and gave it to me. And I've carried that knife. In fact, I'll show it to you.
Yes.
I've carried this
That's cool.
with me on every operation I've ever been on, and it served me well.
That's a great one. And then the question that I try to ask everybody at the very end of these is, as you kind of look back at the years that you put in, the ups and downs, obviously like going into a patrol base that had over 50% of the folks taken out the night before, the sacrifices you made, would you go back and do all that again?
Absolutely. It was, how could you not do that? If I hadn't done it, somebody else would have done it. But I did it, and I don't regret anything one way or the other. In fact, I consider most of it a great learning experience.
Thanks so much, Keith. This was so much fun for me. I think people are going to really enjoy this.
Hopefully so. Lots of scar tissue.
Perfect. So that's it. Thank you for doing this. And I know I took you longer than I promised, so appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed this combat story. We've got a few listener comments. The first one is from YouTube. It's on the Pete Blaber interview, and it's from David Brown. He says, "Thank you for interviewing Pete Blaber. I was in 187 Infantry, 10th Mountain on Operation Anaconda, March 2nd, 2002. Blaber was the man on that op, and his men saved our asses. Keep up the good fight. Thank you." And I remember studying Operation Anaconda before I went to Afghanistan because I was in a unit with a lot of the pilots who were in that. So it just felt important to me. And it was one of the first books, in my opinion, written that really showed what Afghanistan was like in the early days. So I completely agree with you, David. I can't even imagine what your stories are like. So thanks for what you did. And thanks for leaving that comment. The next comment is on the Daryl Utt video from Mark S. It says, "Each interview tops the previous. Well done, Ryan and Combat Story. My thanks for what you and your guests do and have done. My personal Saturday noon go-to site. Even we old Cold Warriors from the 80s and 90s enjoy this channel and look forward each week to new episodes." Oh, thanks so much, Mark. I appreciate it. I got to get into some of the Cold War stuff as well. I have an older brother who was stationed in Germany during the Cold War, pilot, Fulda Gap, all of that. So I definitely appreciate where you're coming from, and thank you for sharing that. And normally we only do 2 comments, but I wanted to do a third one today, just to talk about something. This one is also from the Daryl Utt video. It's from Tony Keast, and he says, geez, this is up there in the top combat story interviews. I've lost count of how many there are in that category, but it's got to be half a dozen. What a dude. This podcast absolutely had everything in it. Next level Homo sapien stuff. Time flew by. I'm excited with the heads up about who's lined up for the future content, Medal of Honor wise. Thanks, guys. And I just wanted to touch on this one because we had Woody Williams lined up to interview. Woody was a 98-year-old Medal of Honor recipient from World War II, Iwo Jima Marine. The reason we had him lined up was Daryl Utt connected us. Many of you who listen to this will have seen the news, but sadly, Woody passed away last week. So we are obviously not going to have him on. We had been scheduling an interview with him through his grandson and his family, and we were literally 8 days too slow. So for me, I am actually not upset that we didn't interview him. I mean, it would have been nice for us to do. There's a lot of stories about Woody out there. I'm just saddened that we lost a Medal of Honor recipient like him and the sacrifices that he takes with him. So I would just say that one in particular we had lined up, but we will not be doing that. But for those who have not learned about Woody, I encourage you to just look him up and see what amazing stuff this man did. And truly, like, up until a week before he passed away, he was completely with it as a 98-year-old, tough as nails veteran. So I'm sad we didn't get that done, but I will say thank you all for these comments. This is why we try to capture these stories for people who haven't had a chance to share them. So I hope you enjoy them as much as I do, and I'll talk to you next time. Take care. Stay safe.